The sharp, insulting slap of crumpled paper hitting the polished mahogany table echoed loudly through the glass-walled boardroom. It was a termination draft, heavily redacted with aggressive red ink, tossed directly at me like a piece of worthless trash. "You are a dinosaur, Evelyn," the voice sneered. It belonged to Chloe, our newly appointed chief marketing officer. She was 25, cloaked in an overpowering, sickly sweet designer perfume, and possessed the kind of unearned arrogance that only nepotism and a severe lack of self-awareness could breed. She stood at the head of the table, leaning forward, her hands pressed flat against the glass, trying to physically dominate the space. Behind her, a row of 3 young women, her newly hired, equally incompetent inner circle, giggled like a synchronized chorus of sycophants. "Look at you," Chloe continued, her lips curling in absolute disgust as her eyes raked over my simple 7 charcoal gray turtleneck. She couldn't recognize that it was spun from the rarest vicuña wool, hand-tailored in a quiet atelier in Milan, completely devoid of the gaudy logos she so desperately draped herself in. To her, I was just an aging, invisible mid-level manager. "You don't understand the modern market. You don't understand virality. You're outdated, Evelyn. An obsolete glitch in my new, streamlined system. You're taking up space that belongs to innovators. Consider this your final warning before I formally throw you out with the rest of the legacy trash." The silence in the room was suffocating. Every other employee kept their heads down, terrified of drawing the wrath of the CEO's favorite new pet. They expected me to cry. They expected my hands to shake, for my voice to break, or perhaps for me to beg for my livelihood. I didn't do any of those things. I remained perfectly still, my posture impeccably straight. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. My face was a mask of absolute, chilling indifference. With calm, unhurried movements, I picked up my phone, an older, unassuming model that hid a custom, impenetrable encryption network. I opened a direct, secure line to the managing director of my private wealth fund. My fingers tapped out a single, devastating sentence. "Freeze the holding company's credit lines. Initiate the corporate purge." I pressed send. The digital lock clicked. The hourglass had officially been flipped. Before I tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled her pathetic illusion of power, how I drained every stolen cent from her accounts and made her beg on her knees in front of the very people she tormented, tell me, where are you listening to this from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe that true karma isn't just fate, but a perfectly executed plan, hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to hear every single detail of this. Let's rewind the clock. 3 months ago. Before the humiliation, before the boardroom, before the venom, the corporate landscape in the United States right now is a brutal, shifting tectonic plate, with sweeping tech layoffs, economic restructuring, and the relentless pressure of a toxic hustle culture. The atmosphere on the 45th floor of our Manhattan headquarters was already thick with anxiety. We were a heritage tech and media firm, struggling to pivot in a hyper-competitive digital era. The board of directors was panicking. They wanted youth. They wanted a savior. Instead, they got Chloe. Chloe didn't climb the corporate ladder. She was airlifted onto it by her father, a wealthy country club golfing buddy of our current CEO. She arrived on her first day, not like an executive ready to work, but like a reality TV star making a grand entrance. She was a walking billboard of insecurity masked as extreme wealth, oversized designer belts, bags covered in interlocking monograms, and an attitude that demanded total, immediate subservience. I, on the other hand, had been sitting quietly in the project management sector for years. I was 38. I drove an unremarkable, 5-year-old sedan to work. I spoke only when necessary. To the naked eye, I was the very definition of a corporate drone, grinding away for a middle-class paycheck. No one knew that I didn't need the salary. No one knew that my presence in this decaying company was actually an undercover reconnaissance mission. I am the sole heiress to a private equity empire, and my family's fund was quietly acquiring the majority debt of this exact corporation. I was here to observe, to find the rot from the inside out. before I formally took my seat at the head of the table. But Chloe didn't see a silent observer. She saw a target. Her hostility was immediate and visceral. In her warped, superficial worldview, anyone over the age of 30 who didn't flaunt their bank account was a failure. A lower-class citizen meant to be stepped on. She quickly established a regime of psychological terror. She pushed out 3 brilliant veteran employees within her first month, replacing them with her sorority sisters' girls, whose only qualifications were a high follower count on social media and a vicious talent for corporate bullying. The workplace transformed into a high school cafeteria, governed by absolute cruelty. The air became toxic. Meetings turned into echo chambers of praise for Chloe's disastrous, expensive marketing ideas, and I became her favorite punching bag. She would purposefully schedule vital strategy meetings at 8:00 p.m. on Fridays, knowing the older staff had families, only to spend the hour scrolling through her phone and mocking our presentations. She would accidentally spill her iced matcha lattes on my neatly organized files, offering a fake, high-pitched "oops" before ordering me to clean it up. She referred to me, in front of entire departments, as the company's fossil record. She weaponized ageism and classism with a terrifying, hollow joy. She thought she was untouchable because the CEO blindly endorsed her fresh perspective. She thought my silence was submission. She thought my lack of designer labels meant a lack of power. She mistook my supreme patience for weakness. Every time she rolled her eyes at me, every time she made a derogatory comment about my cheap clothes, every time she openly sneered at my meticulous, data-driven reports, I simply documented it. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold, analytical thrill of a predator watching its prey blindly walk into a steel trap. I allowed her to build her throne of arrogance higher and higher, because I knew a fundamental truth about gravity: the higher the pedestal, the more shattered the bones when the fall inevitably comes. And I was already meticulously loosening the screws on her throne, preparing to tear her entire world apart. Pardon, the humiliation? If you have ever worked in corporate America, you know exactly how the atmosphere shifts when a toxic leader takes the helm. The air pressure drops. The quiet hum of productivity is replaced by the frantic, nervous energy of survival. Under Chloe's regime, the 45th floor didn't just change, it decayed. She immediately began her campaign of cultural optimization, which was just a sterile corporate buzzword for pushing out anyone who actually knew how to do their job, and replacing them with her personal entourage. She hired 3 of her former sorority sisters as brand strategists. They were a terrifyingly uniformed trio of women in their early 20s, cloaked in fast fashion blazers that photographed well but frayed at the seams, armed with iced oat milk lattes and an astonishing lack of intellectual curiosity. They didn't work. They curated. They spent their days filming day in the life of a tech exec videos for their social media, effectively turning our once respected division into a vapid content farm. And in their meticulously filtered world, I was the designated antagonist to Chloe and her disciples. I wasn't a colleague. I was an NPC, a non-playable character. That was the exact term she used when she thought I couldn't hear her. She called me a wage slave, a pathetic, dusty relic, who was simply there to populate the background of her glittering, upwardly mobile life. The psychological warfare was calculated and constant. Chloe had a sadistic talent for discovering what people valued and subtly stepping on it. She realized very quickly that I did not react to standard office bullying. When she left me off important email chains, I simply acquired the data through the server logs. When she took credit for my quarterly risk analysis reports, presenting my painstaking financial modeling as her own intuitive market foresight, I sat in the back of the room, my face a mask of serene marble, silently grading her abysmal presentation skills. Because I didn't break, her attacks became increasingly personal, targeting what she perceived as my tragic, lower-class existence. The climax of her cruelty, the moment that truly set the stage for her total destruction, happened on a rainy Tuesday during a critical pitch to a major European streaming conglomerate. This was a make-or-break deal for the company, a desperate attempt to inject capital into our bleeding ledgers. I had spent 3 weeks building the pitch deck, analyzing international market demographics, and structuring a flawless integration pipeline. 10 minutes before the European executives logged onto the massive screens in the central boardroom, Chloe strutted in with her entourage. Evelyn, she snapped, not even bothering to look at me. She was too busy adjusting her reflection in the glass wall. The catered lunch is late, and honestly, this room smells like, well, it smells like you. Like stale coffee and desperation. Be a dear. And go down to the lobby. Grab the artisanal sushi platters from the courier. And then wipe down these tables. You left fingerprints on the glass. I looked up from my tablet. I had designed the entire presentation she was about to give. My title was Senior Project Manager, not a personal assistant. The rest of the staff in the room froze, holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The courier is required to bring the catering up to the reception desk. Chloe, I replied, my voice dangerously calm, the pitch perfectly modulated to a soft, even timbre. And the presentation begins in exactly 8 minutes. You still haven't reviewed the final data sets. Chloe stopped. She turned around slowly, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She walked over to where I was sitting, leaning down, so her face was inches from mine. The overwhelming stench of her synthetic vanilla and patchouli perfume was nauseating. Listen to me very carefully. Evelyn, she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. You don't tell me what to do. You are a glorified secretary who somehow survived the last round of layoffs because they felt sorry for you. Look at you. She gestured wildly at my outfit. I was wearing a tailored, double-breasted jacket in a deep navy hue. It had no visible branding. To her untrained, logo-obsessed eyes, it was a cheap department store find. She couldn't recognize the drape of virgin wool woven on a traditional loom, or the subtle sheen of natural horn buttons. She only understood wealth if it was screaming. True wealth, generational wealth, always whispers. You have zero aesthetic. You have zero ambition, Chloe continued, performing for her giggling friends, who were filming the interaction on their phones. You drive a car that belongs in a scrapyard. You bring your lunch in Tupperware. You are the absolute definition of a corporate peasant. I am trying to project an image of extreme luxury and cutting-edge success to these Europeans, and your very presence is dragging down my brand value. So you are going to get up. You are going to fetch the food like a good little helper. And then you are going to stand in the corner and serve us our water. Do you understand? Or do I need to call HR and tell them you're being insubordinate? The sheer audacity of her entitlement hung in the air like heavy smoke. She was demanding that a senior analyst act as her private waitress in front of international clients, purely to feed her own ego. If I were a normal employee, dependent on this paycheck to survive the crushing cost of living in New York City, this would have been a profoundly traumatizing humiliation. It was designed to strip away my dignity, to remind me of my place at the bottom of her imaginary hierarchy. But I am not a normal employee. I didn't flush with embarrassment. I didn't clench my fists. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes. And in that brief second, beneath her heavy, baked-on makeup and her aggressive posturing, I saw exactly what she was trying to hide. I noticed the subtle, microscopic peeling on the leather piping of her designer tote bag. A dead giveaway of a high-tier counterfeit manufactured in Guangzhou. I noticed the way the gold plating on her layered necklaces was slightly too brassy, catching the fluorescent light unnaturally, but more importantly, I noticed the panicked vibration of her smartwatch. It lit up for a fraction of a second, displaying an aggressive, red notification. Final notice. Minimum payment overdue. She wasn't a queen. She was a drowning woman, clutching a raft made of maxed-out credit cards and fake leather, screaming at the ocean to obey her. Of course. Chloe, I said softly. My voice was smooth, completely devoid of sarcasm. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. I will handle the catering. I wouldn't want to disrupt your brand value. I walked out of the room in total silence, feeling the burning stares of my colleagues on my back. I could hear Chloe laughing loudly as the door closed, boasting to her friends about how she had finally broken the old workhorse. She thought she had won. She thought my compliance was a white flag of surrender. She didn't realize that by sending me out of that room, she had just given me 50 uninterrupted minutes alone at my desk. 50 minutes to bypass the company's internal firewall. 50 minutes to access her restricted departmental budget files. 50 minutes to begin laying the explosive charges at the foundation of her miserable, fraudulent life. The humiliation was over. The investigation had officially begun. Par trois. The investigation. I did go down to the lobby. I tipped the exhausted courier a crisp $100 bill, took the heavy platters of overpriced, farm-raised sashimi, and left them sitting in the staff kitchen refrigerator. I had absolutely no intention of serving them. Then I walked back to my cubicle in the deserted open-plan office. Through the soundproof glass of the main boardroom, I could see Chloe aggressively gesturing at the digital whiteboard. Undoubtedly, butchering the nuanced demographic analysis I had spent weeks compiling. Her friends were nodding along, completely oblivious to the bored, unimpressed expressions of the European executives on the screen. Out here, in the deafening silence of the empty floor, I went to work. They thought they had banished me to the corner. They didn't realize they had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I didn't open my company-issued laptop. Instead, I reached into the hidden compartment of my bag and pulled out my personal machine, a matte black, custom-built Ultrabook equipped with a military-grade encrypted network protocol. I am not just the silent beneficiary of a generational wealth fund. My academic background is in forensic accounting and hostile corporate takeovers. I specialize in finding the rot hidden deep within the financial architecture of failing companies. And this company was bleeding out. I just needed to find the exact puncture wound. It took me exactly 4 keystrokes to bypass the chief information officer's pathetically outdated internal firewall. I didn't need to hack into the system. As the incoming majority shareholder whose acquisition papers were already quietly signed in a downtown law office, I already possessed master administrative clearance. I was simply wearing an invisible crown. I bypassed the standard HR files and dove straight into the central nervous system of the corporation, the unrestricted financial ledgers of the marketing department. Numbers do not lie. They do not wear cheap, overpowering perfume. They do not throw tantrums. And they do not care about your social media aesthetic. Numbers tell a brutal, objective story. And the story Chloe's department was telling was a masterclass in amateur, desperate fraud. I started with the quarterly discretionary budget. It was hemorrhaging cash. I ran a cross-referencing algorithm, filtering the data for irregularities, duplicate payments, and unverified vendor contracts. Within 60 seconds, the screen lit up with a cascade of red flags. Chloe wasn't just bad at her job. She was an active parasite. I zoomed in on a cluster of highly suspicious outbound wire transfers. Over the past 3 months, Chloe had authorized over $300,000 in payments to 3 separate external consulting agencies. The invoices were vague, labeled with meaningless corporate word salad like synergistic brand alignment strategies and Gen Z paradigm integration. I pulled the tax identification numbers for these so-called agencies and ran them through the New York State Corporate Registry. A cold, razor-sharp smile touched the corners of my mouth. All 3 were limited liability companies LLCs registered just 4 days after Chloe was hired. They had no physical office addresses, no operational history, and no digital footprint. They were ghost vendors, classic shell corporations. And when I dug into the registration documents to find the managing directors of these dummy companies, I found exactly what I expected. The names listed belonged to the 3 young women currently sitting in the glass boardroom, nodding at Chloe's presentation. She was systematically siphoning company funds, routing the money through her friends' fake agencies, and draining the corporation's lifeblood to fund their lifestyle. It was embezzlement. It was federal wire fraud. And it was painfully, embarrassingly sloppy. But why? Why risk 20 years in a federal penitentiary for a few $100,000? To answer that, I needed to look beyond the corporate server. I initiated a background financial sweep on Chloe's personal public records, a standard due diligence procedure for any executive-level employee under review by a private equity board. The data packet downloaded instantly. As I scrolled through her personal financial history, The illusion of the terrifying girl boss completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a tragic, hollow shell. Chloe was drowning in an ocean of unsecured debt. The background check revealed 4 maxed-out, high-interest credit cards, a severely delinquent auto loan on a luxury SUV that was currently 3 weeks away from being repossessed, and a mountain of unpaid personal loans. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I pictured the heavily branded designer tote bag she had slammed on the table earlier. I remembered the unnatural brassy tone of her jewelry and the peeling edge of her leather shoes. It all made perfect sense now. In the modern American landscape of social media obsession, the pressure to project extreme wealth and success had completely shattered her reality. She was spending money she didn't have, to impress people she didn't know, to maintain a digital facade that was entirely fabricated. When her own credit dried up, she didn't cut back. She simply decided the company's treasury was her personal piggy bank. I didn't feel angry. Anger is a hot, uncontrolled emotion that leads to mistakes. I felt the profound, chilling calm of a surgeon looking at a terminal scan. She had woven her own noose. I just needed to calibrate the exact moment to pull the lever. I didn't immediately lock her out of the system. That would be too quick, too merciful. If I exposed her now, she would simply be quietly fired, allowed to scurry away into the shadows to spin a victim narrative on her social media platforms. No, I wanted utter, undeniable destruction. I wanted her to feel the very humiliation she so casually inflicted on others. I wanted the ground to crumble beneath her stilettos, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left to run. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I didn't stop the fraudulent payments. Instead, I meticulously rerouted the destination accounts. I linked the ghost vendor payouts directly into a holding escrow account controlled by my private equity firm, quietly trapping the stolen funds under legal lock and key. Then I installed a silent, automated trigger on the marketing department's corporate expense accounts. The trap was fully armed. The tripwire was set. I closed my laptop, the screen going completely black, hiding the digital guillotine I had just assembled. I checked my reflection in the dark monitor. Not a single hair was out of place. My expression was perfectly, beautifully blank. I stood up, walked to the staff kitchen, and finally picked up the trays of sushi. The 50 minutes were almost up. As I walked back into the boardroom, balancing the heavy trays, the European executives were already logging off, their faces tight with polite disdain. The pitch had been a catastrophic failure. Chloe was visibly sweating, frantically trying to blame the technology, her friends, the weather, anything but her own incompetence. "Your lunch is served." "Chloe," I said softly, setting the trays down on the glass table. She glared at me, her eyes manic and cruel, completely unaware that she was no longer looking at her subordinate. She was looking at her executioner. Par quatre. The destruction. Step 1. Severing the arteries. There is a distinct difference between destroying an enemy and dismantling them. Destruction is a bomb. It is loud, chaotic, and leaves debris everywhere. It is the tactic of the emotionally unstable. Dismantling, however, is a scalpel. It is quiet. It is profoundly precise. You take away the foundation piece by piece, millimeter by millimeter, until the entire structure collapses under its own hollow weight. I had no intention of dropping a bomb on Chloe. I wanted to dismantle her, slowly, painfully, in front of a captive audience. I wanted her to feel the cold, suffocating grip of inevitability. By the time Friday evening rolled around, the European integration deal was officially dead in the water, a direct casualty of Chloe's aggressive incompetence, but in the twisted, delusional ecosystem she had cultivated. Catastrophic failure was just another opportunity to celebrate taking bold risks. She had booked a private dining room at an ultra-exclusive, impossibly expensive restaurant in the meatpacking district. It was the kind of establishment that didn't publish prices on its menus, where the waiting list was 6 months long, and where the culinary experience was designed specifically to separate the aggressively wealthy from their money. Chloe was treating her 3 brand strategists to a night of extravagant excess. fully intending to charge the multi-thousand-dollar bill to the company's executive entertainment account. She had spent the entire afternoon loudly discussing the vintage small batch champagne she planned to order, making absolutely sure I heard every syllable from my cubicle. She considered this dinner a victory lap. She genuinely believed her recommendation to terminate my employment was sitting on the CEO's desk, awaiting signature. She didn't know that while she was obsessing over her dinner outfit, I had spent my afternoon quietly reconfiguring the digital permissions on the corporate banking portal. I wasn't at the restaurant that night, but I didn't need to be. Through the real-time financial tracking software on my encrypted laptop, I had a front-row seat to the massacre. I sat alone in the dim, quiet luxury of my penthouse, nursing a glass of 20-year-old single malt scotch. Watching the glowing numbers on my screen, I could picture the scene perfectly. The dim, amber lighting of the private room. The bone china plates smeared with the remnants of white truffle risotto and gold leaf garnish. The empty bottles of ridiculously marked-up wine. Chloe, undoubtedly holding court at the head of the table, laughing loudly. Her cheap, oversized brass jewelry clanking against the delicate crystal stemware. Then at exactly 10:11 p.m., the digital ping registered on my secure server, an authorization request for $4.85000 from the restaurant's merchant terminal. With a slow, deliberate exhale, I pressed a single key. Request denied. Error code 05. Do not honor. Imagine the scene. The impeccably dressed sommelier, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, returning to the table, the subtle clearing of his throat, the discreet, murmured apology, as he leans down to whisper in Chloe's ear. I am so sorry, madame, but the institution has declined the charge. Chloe's first reaction would be loud, indignant offense. She would laugh a harsh, grating, defensive sound loudly proclaiming to her friends that the bank's fraud protection must have triggered because of the high amount. She would confidently reach into her designer wallet and slide over a second card, her personal premium credit card. 30 seconds later, a second ping on my screen. A second denial. This was the exact moment the oxygen would begin to leave the room. The confident, arrogant smirk would slide off Chloe's face. The harsh, warm lighting of the restaurant would suddenly feel oppressively hot. I could almost feel the sudden, sharp spike of cortisol and the cold sweat of panic mixing with her synthetic perfume. She would pull out a third card. A fourth. Her hand would start trembling, her manicured nails tapping frantically against the polished wood of the table. Declined. 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 Her friends, the sycophants who only tolerated her for the free luxury experiences and the proximity to perceived power, would stop laughing. The silence at the table would become suffocating. They would stare at her, not with sympathy, but with the cold, calculating judgment of parasites, realizing their host had just died. In their shallow world, there is no sin greater than being poor, and Chloe was currently bleeding out on the dining room floor. According to the final transaction log that hit my screen at 10:00 p.m., Chloe eventually had to drain the absolute last remaining funds from her checking account, combining it with an emergency cash advance on a high-interest store credit card, just to cover the bill and escape the restaurant. She didn't leave a tip. Monday morning arrived with the heavy electric tension of an impending storm. I was at my desk at 7:00 sipping my black coffee, casually reviewing the final stages of the corporate acquisition paperwork that would soon make me the legal owner of the building we were sitting in. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, the elevator doors flew open. Chloe stormed onto the 45th floor, and the illusion of the flawless executive was completely shattered. She looked physically ill. Her makeup was thick, hastily applied in a desperate attempt to cover the dark section with go.com, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. Her hair lacked its usual glossy blowout, but it was her eyes that told the real story. They were wild, darting, trapped. The swagger was gone. She moved with the frantic, jerky energy of cornered prey. She marched straight toward my desk, bypassing her own office entirely. Her heels slammed against the floorboards, practically vibrating with misdirected rage. "You," she hissed, her voice trembling, She dropped her heavy leather tote bag onto my desk with a loud, aggressive thud. "What did you do?" I looked up slowly, not breaking my posture, not flinching. "Good morning. Clue. Do you need assistance with the weekly analytics report? Don't play stupid with me." "You old witch," she snarled, leaning over my desk, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper so the rest of the floor wouldn't hear. "The corporate cards, the entire department's discretionary budget, it's frozen. Everything is locked. I had to pay for a client dinner out of my own pocket this weekend because the system crashed." She was lying. Of course. There was no client. But her desperation was a living, breathing thing in the air between us. She needed someone to blame, to maintain her fragile sanity. "System crash," I repeated softly, my tone laced with a perfectly calibrated mixture of innocence and mild, professional concern. I gently turned my monitor toward her, displaying a completely fabricated, highly technical-looking error log I had generated that morning. "I'm afraid there hasn't been a crash. Chloe," I explained, my voice smooth as silk, echoing the whispered cadence of a ghost. "It appears the automated auditing software flagged several structural anomalies in the department's external vendor payouts. Specifically, the accounts linked to your recent brand alignment consultants. Standard security protocol dictates an automatic freeze on all outgoing funds until the internal ledger can be verified." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, watching her pupils dilate in pure terror. "I assumed, as the chief marketing officer, you would have received the automated notification from the legal department." All the blood drained from her face, her skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. The word auditing hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She stumbled backward, her hand blindly reaching out to grip the edge of my desk for balance. She knew. She knew the ghost vendors were trapped. She knew her lifeline was severed. "Fix it," she gasped. Her voice completely lost its commanding edge, reduced to a pathetic, ragged plea. "You know this archaic system better than anyone. Override the freeze. Fix it right now, Evelyn. Or, I swear to God I will end your career." I looked at her trembling hands. I looked at the way her chest heaved as she struggled for air. I offered her a very small, utterly chilling smile. It was the smile of a spider watching a fly exhaust itself in the web. "I'm sorry, Chloe," I whispered softly. "But as you said, I'm just an outdated glitch in the system. I don't have the clearance to stop a federal-level audit. You're going to have to let the process run its course." I watched her turn and practically run back to her office, locking the glass door behind her. She immediately pulled the blinds down, shielding herself from the view of the floor. The money was gone. The panic had set in. It was time for the rats to start turning on each other. Par 5. The destruction, step 2. Internal fragmentation. There is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that occurs when a group of toxic, self-serving individuals realizes they are trapped. They do not band together in solidarity. They do not form a defensive perimeter. The fragile bonds of their superficial alliances instantly dissolve, and they immediately begin to cannibalize each other to ensure their own survival. It is the purest, most brutal form of human nature, and I had a front-row seat to the entire spectacle. Having severed Chloe's financial lifeline, the next phase of the demolition was to strip away her remaining armor, her loyal entourage. The 3 brand strategists who formed Chloe's inner circle were not criminal masterminds. They were vapid, easily manipulated girls who had blindly signed the LLC registration paperwork because Chloe promised them a glamorous, expense-paid lifestyle. They had no idea they were committing federal wire fraud. They were the weak links in her pathetic chain, and breaking them was astonishingly easy. I didn't need to confront them. I simply let the silence and the paranoia do the heavy lifting. On Tuesday morning, the atmosphere on the 45th floor was suffocatingly tense. Chloe had locked herself in her office, the blinds tightly drawn, leaving her 3 disciples stranded at their desks in the open floor plan. They were whispering frantically to each other, their eyes darting nervously toward the locked glass door. The free lunches had stopped. The corporate credit cards they used for their daily matcha lattes were suddenly declining. The glamour was fading. leaving only the cold reality of a corporate environment they did not understand. It was time to introduce a little legal terror into their morning routine. At precisely 10, Hima bless M. Knowing the girls always congregated near the high-capacity communal printer to gossip, I executed a remote print command from my encrypted server. I didn't send a company memo. I sent a highly classified-looking legal document, meticulously formatted to resemble an impending external investigation. The header was bold, stark, and terrifying. Notice of impending subpoena, Deuces Tecum. Agency. Internal Revenue Service and Securities and Exchange Commission. Subject. Investigation of fraudulent vendor payments. Below the header, I listed the exact names of the 3 shell LLCs, explicitly noting the registered names of the 3 brand strategists as the primary targets for financial audit and potential criminal indictment. I let the printer churn out the 3 crisp, terrifying pages, just as the girls walked by. From the reflection in my darkened monitor, I watched the tallest of the 3 casually pick up the pages, intending to toss them aside. I saw the exact second her eyes scanned the bold text. I saw the color instantly drain from her face, leaving her spray-tanned skin a sickly NMR, mottled gray. She grabbed the arms of her 2 friends, pulling them close, her manicured finger trembling violently as she pointed to their legal names printed in black and white next to the words, "Federal Offense." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The plastic veneer of their friendship completely shattered. Panic is a feral, ugly emotion. They didn't walk back to their desks. They marched directly toward Chloe's locked office. They didn't knock. One of them aggressively swiped her keycard, bypassing the lock, and they stormed inside, slamming the heavy glass door shut behind them. Even through the soundproof glass, the visual of their argument was a masterpiece of chaos. They were waving the printed document in Chloe's face. Chloe was standing behind her massive mahogany desk, waving her arms frantically, desperately trying to project authority. But her posture was defensive. Her shoulders hunched. The girls were leaning over the desk, their faces contorted in genuine rage and terror. One of them was actually crying, her heavy mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. They were demanding answers. They were demanding protection. But Chloe had nothing left to give them. She was broke, terrified, and backed into a corner. I sat at my desk, quietly sipping a cup of herbal tea, watching the implosion with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. I could read their lips well enough to understand the trajectory of the conversation. "We are going to prison. Chloe, you said this was just standard consulting. I'm calling my father's lawyer. I'm telling them everything." That was the fatal blow. The threat of a lawyer. The threat of exposure. In that moment, Chloe realized that her most loyal followers were about to become the state's star witnesses against her. The girls stormed out of the office 10 minutes later, completely ignoring Chloe's desperate pleas for them to come back. They hurriedly packed their designer bags, completely ignoring their computer screens, and practically ran toward the elevators. They were abandoning ship. They were leaving Chloe to drown alone. As the elevator doors closed behind them, I looked at Chloe's office. She was standing perfectly still, staring blankly at the empty space where her empire used to be. The isolation was now absolute. But a rat cornered in a trap does not simply accept its fate. It bites wildly at whatever is closest, and I was the closest target. Later that evening, long after the rest of the floor had emptied out, the overhead lights automatically dimmed, plunging the office into shadowy twilight. I remained at my desk, perfectly silent in the darkness, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of my laptop screen. Chloe had stayed late, too, through my encrypted network monitoring software. I watched her log into her desktop. She wasn't preparing a defense. She wasn't writing a resignation letter. She was attempting to forge a digital trail of evidence to frame me for the embezzlement. It was almost insulting how amateurish her execution was. She was frantically searching the internal servers for old financial authorizations bearing my digital signature. She was attempting to copy my credentials and paste them onto the fraudulent invoices from the ghost LLCs. She was trying to alter the metadata of the wire transfers to make it look like I had initiated the payouts from my administrative terminal. She was typing with the heavy-handed, erratic cadence of pure panic. Backspace. Delete. Copy-paste. She genuinely believed she was executing a masterful cyberframing.com. She had no concept of shadow servers. She had no idea what a keystroke logger was. She didn't comprehend that every single desperate click of her mouse, every altered timestamp, and every forged document was being recorded in real time, backed up to my private equity firm's secure cloud, and timestamped with her machine's unique IP and MAC address. She was literally filming her own confession to corporate sabotage and forgery, and handing it directly to me. I watched her struggle for 3 agonizing hours. I watched her make fundamental accounting errors that a first-year finance student would catch. She was sweating profusely, her breathing ragged and shallow, vibrating with the manic energy of a woman who believes she is outsmarting the system. Atuns prezice, otus peme. She finally hit save on a heavily manipulated, completely absurd document titled Evidence of Embezzlement. Evelyn. She printed it out, placed it in a sleek manila folder, and stamped it with the word confidential. I watched from the shadows as she emerged from her office, clutching the folder to her chest like a life preserver. She walked past my dark, seemingly empty cubicle without a second glance, her heels echoing hollowly in the massive, silent room. She was heading toward the executive elevator, planning to leave the folder on the CEO's desk for him to find first thing in the morning. She thought she had survived. She thought she had outmaneuvered the outdated glitch. I allowed her to walk all the way to the elevator bay before I quietly closed my laptop. I had everything I needed. The trap wasn't just sprung, it was welded shut. The evidence was irrefutable. The witnesses were alienated. The financial ruin was complete. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into this building, believing she was an apex predator who had successfully eliminated her rival. She would step into the boardroom expecting to receive my head on a silver platter. She had no idea that tomorrow morning, the true owner of the company was finally coming to claim her throne, and the execution block was already prepared. En par-six. The climax. Wednesday morning arrived. The air on the 45th floor was stagnant, thick with the metallic electrifying tension of an impending corporate slaughter. Chloe arrived at 8:00 a.m. sharp, a full hour earlier than her usual grand entrance. She was dressed for war, or at least, her deeply flawed, highly commercialized interpretation of it. She wore a sharply tailored, aggressive crimson blazer, but the structured shoulder pads couldn't hide the frantic, rigid way she held her body. She had layered on heavy matte foundation to mask the exhaustion, but up close, the makeup was already beginning to fracture around her mouth and eyes, betraying the sleepless, terrified night she had just endured. She walked with a forced, hyper-exaggerated swagger, clutching the manila folder she had fabricated the night before like a sacred shield. She marched directly into the main glass boardroom, the undisputed centerpiece of the executive floor, and ordered her assistant, a terrified junior intern who hadn't fled with the rest of the entourage, to summon me. I took my time. I poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, checked the real-time status of the final acquisition transfer on my encrypted phone, and smoothed the lapels of my charcoal cashmere blazer. It was time to pull the curtain down on this miserable theater production. When I stepped into the boardroom, Chloe was standing at the head of the massive mahogany table. She had laid out her props meticulously, her counterfeit designer bag placed visibly near the edge, her smartphone positioned to record the interaction, and the thick manila folder resting squarely in the center of the table. "Close the door, Evelyn," she ordered, her voice sharp and nasal, attempting to project a commanding authority that she severely lacked. I quietly shut the heavy glass door, sealing us in the soundproof chamber. Outside, the rest of the floor was completely deserted. The silence in the room was absolute. "You really thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Chloe began, pacing slowly behind the large leather executive chair. She traced her perfectly manicured fingernails along the back of it, adopting the posture of a television prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You thought because you've been sitting in this decaying building for years, hiding behind your cheap clothes and your pathetic little spreadsheets, that no one was watching you." I remained perfectly still. my hands resting lightly in my pockets. I didn't say a word. I simply let her speak, giving her enough rope to completely hang herself. I know what you did, Evelyn, she hissed. Suddenly stopping and slamming both hands onto the table, she leaned forward, her eyes wide and manic, a desperate, feral grin stretching across her face. I know you manipulated the internal ledgers. I know you set up those ghost LLCs to siphon funds from my department's budget. You tried to frame me to cover up your own embezzlement. It's actually pathetic. A desperately jealous, outdated fossil, trying to steal from the company just to feel relevant. She tapped her index finger aggressively against the manila folder. I spent the entire night running a forensic audit of the servers. I found everything. Your digital footprint, the forged invoices, the altered timestamps. It is all right here. Securely documented. Explicitly linking your administrative credentials to the missing funds. She was entirely breathless now. High on the adrenaline of her own profound delusion, she genuinely believed her frantic, amateurish keystrokes from the night before had somehow rewritten reality. She believed she had outsmarted a system she fundamentally did not comprehend. You are done, she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You aren't just fired, Evelyn. You are going to federal prison. And I am personally going to hand this folder to the CEO. Before she could finish her sentence, the heavy magnetic locks of the boardroom doors disengaged with a loud, authoritative click. Clue froze. We both turned toward the entrance. The double glass doors swung open. Stepping into the room was Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of the corporation. He was a man who usually commanded a room with boisterous energy, but today, his face was pale, drawn, and coated in a sheen of nervous perspiration. He was not alone. Behind him filed in an intimidating phalanx of power, two senior partners from the city's most ruthless corporate law firm, carrying slim, lockable briefcases of full-grain leather. Behind them stood the chief financial officer, looking physically ill, and finally, two unsmiling men in dark, impeccably tailored suits. Private security detail from my equity firm. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the financial and legal authority standing in the doorway was suffocating. Chloe's face instantly transformed. The malicious sneer vanished, replaced by a brilliant, plastic smile of profound relief. In her twisted reality, this was the cavalry. She believed the CEO had received her frantic, late-night emails and brought the legal team to execute my immediate arrest. Richard, thank God you're here, Chloe gasped, quickly grabbing the forged manila folder and rushing around the table toward him. She practically vibrated with eager anticipation. I was just detaining her. I have the evidence. I uncovered the entire scheme. Evelyn has been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the marketing budget. It's all in this file. I swear I stayed up all night verifying the logs. She extended the folder toward him, her hand shaking with desperate excitement. I saved the company. Richard. Richard Sterling didn't take the folder. He didn't even look at it. He didn't look at Chloe. He looked at her outstretched hand with the kind of distant, detached disgust one might reserve for a dead insect on a pristine carpet. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Chloe's smile began to falter, her extended arm trembling slightly under the crushing weight of Richard's absolute dismissal. Then the CEO of the company, the man Chloe had spent 3 months desperately trying to impress, the man who had hired her based purely on country club nepotism, physically stepped around her. He bypassed her completely, treating her as if she were entirely invisible. He walked directly toward where I was standing in the corner of the room. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, squared his shoulders, and slowly, respectfully, bowed his head. "Madam Chairman," Richard said. His voice was subdued, entirely stripped of its usual arrogance, trembling with a very real, very raw fear. He kept his eyes lowered as he spoke. The final transfer protocols cleared at 8:15 this morning. The hostile acquisition is officially complete. The former board of directors has been entirely dissolved. The forensic audit team, the legal counsel, and the restructuring division are standing by in the lobby. awaiting your absolute command. He swallowed hard. The Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The company is yours, Mom. Behind him, the two senior lawyers gave a crisp, synchronized nod of acknowledgement in my direction. In the background, the soft, muffled thud of heavy paper hitting the floor broke the silence. I looked past Richard's shoulder. Chloe was standing frozen in the middle of the room. The manila folder she had been holding had slipped from her numb fingers, the forged papers spilling out across the polished hardwood floor in a pathetic "Mesufan." Her brain had completely short-circuited. She was experiencing a catastrophic psychological system failure. She looked at Richard, bowing to me. She looked at the elite lawyers, waiting for my instruction. She looked at my simple, unbranded clothing, and then she looked into my eyes. The realization hit her with the concussive force of a freight train. The outdated glitch. The corporate peasant. The woman she had ordered to fetch sushi and clean tables. The woman she had spent 3 months psychologically terrorizing. It wasn't a subordinate. It was the apex predator. It was the sole owner of the multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that had just swallowed her entire universe whole. All the blood violently rushed from her face, leaving her a ghastly translucent white. Her legs gave out completely. She didn't fall gracefully. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed heavily against the edge of the mahogany table, sliding down until she was practically kneeling on the floor amidst her scattered, forged documents. Her breathing became rapid, shallow, high-pitched gasps as a full-blown panic attack seized her chest. I stepped slowly out of the corner, my heels making zero sound on the floorboards. I walked past the trembling CEO and stopped directly in front of the shakingly, utterly broken woman on the floor. I looked down at her, my face a mask of cold, beautiful, absolute ruin. "You're sitting in my chair, Chloe," I whispered. "Parcept." The aftermath and the conclusion. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. It was the kind of dead, static, quiet that only exists in the epicenter of a catastrophic impact. Chloe was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the scattered, pathetic pages of her forged documents. She looked like a broken porcelain doll. Her aggressive crimson blazer now just a vibrant mockery of the absolute powerlessness radiating from her trembling frame. The thick layers of her matte foundation had cracked her carefully constructed girl-boss facade, melting away to reveal a terrified, deeply in-debt 25-year-old who had just realized she was playing a game of chess against a grandmaster who owned the board. She tilted her head up to look at me. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled from the dark depths of the ocean, struggling against the crushing weight of a reality she could no longer manipulate. "Please." The words scraped out of her throat, small and ragged. It was the first time I had ever heard her voice completely stripped of its manufactured arrogance. I looked down at her. I didn't feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I didn't feel the hot, chaotic surge of anger. I felt nothing but the profound icy calm of a surgeon closing an incision after successfully excising a malignant tumor. I stepped smoothly around the mess of papers on the floor, the polished leather of my custom loafers making no sound. I walked to the head of the table, gently placed my hand on the back of the heavy executive leather chair, the throne she had so desperately tried to claim, and turned to face the room. "Let me explain exactly what is going to happen next. Clue," I began, my voice a soft, perfectly modulated whisper that carried effortlessly across the silent room, because unlike you, I do not believe in loud, messy spectacle. I believe in precision. I gestured slightly toward the two unsmiling senior partners standing by the door. At exactly 8:30 this morning, my legal counsel filed a comprehensive dossier with the White Collar Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission. The file includes irrefutable, cryptographically secured evidence of your attempt to embezzle over $300,000 of corporate funds through 3 unregistered shell companies. Chloe let out a choked "Vedchasp." Her hands flew to her face, her meticulously manicured nails digging into her cheeks. "But that isn't the part that's going to send you to federal prison," I continued, my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the quarterly marketing analytics The part that seals your fate is the utterly pathetic forgery you attempted on your desktop terminal last night. Did you genuinely believe that a woman who controls a multi-billion-dollar private equity portfolio wouldn't install a silent portfolio root-level keystroke logger on the network she was acquiring? We have every single backspace, every altered timestamp, and a real-time screen recording of you desperately trying to frame me. I paused, letting the absolute, crushing finality of my words settle over her. You didn't just commit corporate fraud. Clue. You committed federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and attempted evidence tampering. You handed me the murder weapon with your own fingerprints, securely superglued to the handle. Evelyn, please, she suddenly shrieked, the sound tearing violently through the quiet room. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out as if to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. I had to. You don't understand the pressure. My credit cards are maxed out. They're going to repossess my car. If I lose this job, I lose my apartment. I'll have nothing. I'll do anything. I'll scrub the floors. I'll pay it back. Just please, don't let them take me to jail. I took one smooth, deliberate step backward, ensuring she couldn't touch me. The desperation radiating from her was a foul, toxic scent. It is Madam Chairman to you. I corrected her softly, my eyes narrowing into cold. Obsidian chips. And your luxury apartment in Brooklyn Heights. It was already flagged for pre-foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. You were drowning long before I arrived. I simply removed the life raft. I shifted my gaze away from her sobbing, crumpled form, and looked directly at Richard Sterling, the now former CEO who was still standing rigidly near the door, his face completely drained of color. Richard, I said, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. Process her immediate termination, terminated with extreme prejudice for gross misconduct and criminal activity. No severance package. No COBRA extension. Strip her corporate access codes and seize her company devices immediately. Richard nodded frantically, practically vibrating with the desperate need to comply. Desperate to prove his loyalty to the new regime. Yes, Madam Chairman. Instantly. Security. Please escort her out. The two large men in the dark suits stepped forward. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They gripped Chloe by her upper arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. Her legs gave completely, forcing the guards to practically drag her dead weight. No. Please. Richard, tell them who my father is, she wailed, twisting wildly in the guard's iron grip, her tears leaving ugly, dark streaks of mascara down her foundation-caked face. But Richard just looked at the floor. In the brutal ecosystem of corporate power, her father's country club connections meant absolutely nothing against the crushing weight of a private equity takeover. She was a liability. And in this world, liabilities are excised. I watched in total silence as the heavy glass doors opened. The security guards dragged her out onto the 45th floor. The entire office had frozen. Dozens of employees, the very people she had tormented, belittled, and humiliated for 3 agonizing months, stood silently at their cubicles, watching this spectacle. And standing near the elevators, paralyzed with fear, were her 3 brand strategists. They watched their fearless leader, the woman who had promised them an empire of free luxury, being hauled away like a common thief, sobbing hysterically. They knew the federal subpoenas with their names on them were already in the mail. As the elevator doors chimed and finally closed behind Chloe, cutting off her pathetic wailing, a collective, profound exhale swept across the office floor. The toxic haze had lifted. The rot had been surgically removed. I turned back to the room. Richard was still standing there, waiting for my instruction, clearly hoping his swift compliance had saved his job. I walked over to the massive windows overlooking the sprawling concrete canyons of the Manhattan skyline. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the city. Now, Richard, I said softly, not turning around to look at him, let's discuss your severance package. Because you are the fool who let that parasite into my building in the first place. The total dismantling of the empire was complete. And that, my friends, is how you execute a perfect, Flawless corporate purge. Sometimes. The people who act the loudest, who wear the most expensive labels, and who look down on everyone else are entirely hollow inside. They build their empires on paper-thin lies and maxed-out credit cards. And when you are quiet, when you are patient, and when you let them underestimate you, you can tear their entire fake reality to the ground without ever raising your voice. If you felt that cold, satisfying chill of absolute justice while listening to Chloe's downfall, drop the word karma in the comments section below. I want to know exactly how many of you have dealt with a toxic boss who desperately needed a reality check. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of absolute, ruthless revenge. The corporate world is full of monsters, but remember, the quietest ones in the room are usually the ones holding the keys to the cage. Until next time, stay sharp, stay silent, and never let them see your next move. Goodbye.